Okay, just got to remember what I'm doing, and then we can get going.
Recording in progress.
Okay, ready for action.
Recording.
Good morning again. I'm really sorry. My train was cancelled from Sheffield, so I ended up on a slow train through the Pennines. Right, this is the last in the series of the preparatory lectures that support your dissertation. The topic of this morning's lecture is very much about the document that you prepare. So, it helps you to think in some detail about the form, the structure of the document that you'll submit. It's in two parts, and the first one is a bit more procedural. So I'll be talking about some really important aspects of the regulations. We'll have a little break, and then in the second part, I'll talk a bit more about the structure of the document that you're going to be asked to submit. I'll show you some examples from previous years, and I'll point you in the direction of some help. So I've got half an eye on the chat. This lecture usually generates a lot of questions. I guess it's quite tangible, in the sense that you can understand, very directly how it might relate to the preparation of your submission. So if you have any, I'll pause, occasionally and ask you for questions. But if anything's unclear on the way through, just stick your question in the chat, and I'll try and pause and clarify it, if that's okay. That's the plan. Shouldn't be too long, fingers crossed. So we'll get going. So thinking about the way that you can communicate the work that you've done on your dissertation for someone who will be reading it for the first time. So very much this is a document that you'll be very familiar with, your tutor will be very familiar with, but it'll be examined by other people. So one of the things that you need to bear in mind is you're moving from the kind of planning, thinking, gathering and analysing into the writing up phase. Is what do you need to share with someone that doesn't know anything about you or doesn't know anything about your topic? So there's a variety of things that you need to pass on to provide your reader, your examiner, with some sort of context. So the first of these is very much about how you have designed your dissertation as a researcher, the kinds of decisions that you've made about what to research, but also how to research it. And so the first reminder that I want to put to you is, going back to the methodology lecture. I'm sure you can remember that like it was only yesterday. But in the methodology lecture, I talked at some length about research ethics and integrity. And as part of that, there are a series of things that we were asking you to consider, whether appropriate for your topic. And these are to do with how you as a researcher develop relationships, or how you sustain relationships with people that might be helping you with your research. You'd be making decisions about how to approach people, how to ask people certain questions, how to make sure that anyone's helping you, or anyone who's participating in your questioning is clear about what they're doing and why you're asking them to do that. The ideas of, or, the principles behind good academic practice, or, good research ethics and integrity, also play a part in the dissemination or the writing up of your dissertation. So for some of you more than others, it'll be important that you can pass on not only the decisions that you made in terms of planning your ethics, but also it might be questions about how you protect the identities of certain participants. So in the dissemination, or in the writing of your dissertation. So I'm just muting some people. So for some of you, the writing up will also be a moment when you've got to return to some of those questions around ethics. So if you think that relates to the work that you're doing or the work that you're planning to do, I suggest that you revisit the methodology lecture and you can go through some of the principles of ethics in a bit more detail, and perhaps with your tutor you can discuss how you want to translate that into the preparation and the writing, like the presentation of your dissertation. Another aspect of research ethics and integrity relates to what's called unfair means, or sometimes more specifically to do with plagiarism. So I've got a section now where I want to talk in a bit more of a procedural way about the university regulations and the specific aspects of the regulations that relate to dissertation. So in particular, this is to do with unfair means or academic misconduct. I've put all the links to these sections on Moodle, so you can follow these up in the comfort of your own home, or when you want to perhaps return to them at a later date. So just to maybe to start this into a bit more of a two-way conversation. I mean, it's something that we're kind of familiar with in the academic world. But if we're talking about unfair means or academic misconduct, what might that mean? You can maybe stick something in the chat box if you can, just to start thinking about what this might mean. So not a trick question, but how might unfair means or academic misconduct relate to dissertation in particular? Okay, I've got to change it. I don't know how many people got that in the chat. Changing data to suit the outcome. Yeah, this is a way of trying to perhaps make your dissertation, make your research look more successful than it has been, or perhaps in your view that makes it look more successful. So perhaps it's something that you might think of, or that you could imagine in a kind of scientific laboratory situation where you'd be running an experiment and you get some kind of results that weren't what you were hoping for. So some academics might be tempted to falsify or massage the results that they're getting from those kinds of experiments. Similarly, if you were talking to people either directly with some kind of interview format, or if you were doing questionnaires and doing a more statistical kind of analysis of the results that you're getting back from those questionnaires, to help your dissertation. And there might be a temptation to perhaps to change the way that you're analysing the results to suit the kind of argument or to suit the kind of analysis that you hope to be able to present. So changing data, leaving things out or manipulating the data that you're getting it would be academic misconduct. And I'll say a little bit more about it in a few slides' time. Plagiarism. Again, I'll talk a bit more about plagiarism in the slides to come. Probably the most familiar form of unfair means or academic misconduct that we get through, or we have as a conversation around dissertation. Again, I'll try and explain in detail what plagiarism might be, why it's really important, and what you can do to avoid it or to understand it more. Anything else that you might think of in terms of unfair means or academic misconduct? Not suggesting that you would think about doing it, but just so we're clear about the range of things that these policies cover. Self-plagiarism, again, very relevant for dissertation topics. This self-plagiarism is really when you've already done a piece of work and you effectively recycle it without acknowledgement in your dissertation. So sometimes this is called self-plagiarism, sometimes it's referred to as double submission, but it's a situation where someone uses the same piece of work twice, but passes the second one off as a new piece of work. Okay. So most of these have come up in the chat already. So clearly kind of grasping the idea. Plagiarism, I'll talk through all of these in a bit more detail, but to summarise, plagiarism, probably the most common, double submission or self-plagiarism, which I just mentioned, and fabrication, changing data. All of these you've got already. Another one that's in the news a lot at the moment is to do with commissioning work or buying submissions from essay mills, and all of these are in the orbit of the dissertation. So to just run through these in a bit more detail, the idea of, or the definition of plagiarism would be taking ideas or work from another person. These could be experts in the field, they could be architects, or they could be your fellow students, but taking this work or these ideas and then presenting them as if they're your own work. So effectively copying work from other people and claiming it's yours. So it doesn't matter where the work comes from, it's the way that you present it that would make it plagiarism. And again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. Submitting bought work, as I said, very much in the news at the moment, effectively buying an essay or buying a dissertation from an essay mill or from a kind of independent internet site, again buying it and claiming that it's your work when you've paid someone else to do it. Again, it's something that's in the news a great deal. Universities trying to get ahead of or trying to close down these kinds of essay mills. Recent government legislation moving to make these a criminal offence. So again, something I'm sure you've seen around. You'll have lots of adverts targeting you because you're students. So commissioning an essay in this way would constitute unfair means or academic misconduct. Again, I mentioned this a second ago, double submission or self-plagiarism, resubmitting previously assessed work more than once. And I've had conversations with students in my own dissertation tutorial group either based on previous projects that they've done, or more recently developing a dissertation based on the research methods workshop, for example. And it's absolutely fine for you to use a dissertation as a way of exploring an issue in more detail, or developing a set of interests in a slightly wider context. Most important thing is, if you're developing work in this way, or you're using a previous project as a springboard into the dissertation, you're very clear where the ideas have come from, what you did previously, and how the dissertation works to expand those or to test them in new ways. So it's fine for you to have this kind of enduring interest. Most important is that you're clear, if you are using previous ideas, it's clear how you've expanded those or tested them further. Something else didn't come into the chat. Collusion, again, another form of academic misconduct, harder to do in a dissertation context, if you like. So collusion would be where two or more people worked together on a piece of work and then presented it as if it were two individual pieces. So it's hard to imagine that two dissertations would be produced in this way. But in the broad scheme of academic misconduct, collusion is one of the entries. And then back to fabrication, making things up, which I talked about in a bit more detail, falsifying results to apparently suit your own argument, or to maneuver the analysis that you're presenting into a more favourable situation. And I think there's no need for you to do this. If you set up a set of questions or a kind of experiment, and you work that through and you get results that you didn't expect, then that's fine. The dissertation's a way of explaining and justifying how you set up your experiment in the first place, how you are collecting data, whatever that actually means for you, how you analyse it and how you present it. And so it might be that one of your conclusions is, well, it didn't go as well as I hoped, or I got answers that I completely didn't expect. And so if I did it again, I would change my experiment. That's fine. Research is inevitably, when you ask questions, you don't know what the answers will be. So you can be open to being surprised by the results that you produce through your own analysis. Shouldn't feel tempted to manipulate your data to make your answer fit your question more comfortably. It's fine for you to be able to present work and all of its surprises, and then reflect in the later stages of your dissertation about why there's a disparity between what you actually found compared to perhaps what you expected to find. So just stepping back from these specific instances, it's not clear why students, I'm suggesting it's you, but in general, misconduct does happen infrequently. It happens within the dissertation infrequently. It's not clear why people feel the need to do it. Perhaps it's not clear what acceptable practice actually is. So hopefully just running through these various examples should clarify what counts as academic malpractice, and what you need to avoid doing, or what you need to take advice about if you're uncertain about what you're doing. It may be that in previous work at a lower level of degree, or even before university, cutting and pasting from different sources was acceptable. It's an acceptable way of building up a submission. It may be that you feel the only way that you can pass your dissertation is to do this in some way. Or it might be that you've worked previously in a different academic context where a different set of procedures applies, different set of norms, if you like. And so you're just getting used to the UK education system and might have some uncertainties about what's okay. So I just want to try and both reassure you about the way in which you can successfully use work from other people, and also want to point you towards some fantastic resources that are available in the universities to help you to prepare and refine the dissertation document that you submit. So there's some links I put on Moodle that you can follow up. If you look on the MMU library and study skills websites, there's a whole range of different material that can work you through academic misconduct, very broadly, through plagiarism more specifically, and then turns it around to look at the advantages of using referencing successfully as a way of showing off the range of material that you've explored through your dissertation in a way that gains you credit rather than gets you into trouble. So lots more information about these issues on Moodle. Again, people queuing up to help you, from your tutors, to me, to your studio tutors, to staff in the library, to the Moodle sites themselves. So no reason for you to not find answers if you've got any questions or any doubts about what academic malpractice might constitute, and what plagiarism might mean in more detail. So I try and turn this around, rather than worrying about academic malpractice or unfair means. I think the dissertation is something that encourages you to try and situate your own question in a wide range of other work that helps you to perhaps understand what you're doing in a bit more detail, helps you contextualize the specific questions that you're asking in a much wider range of work. So again, this is a slide that I used when we were talking about literature reviewing, and it's a sort of very crude reminder of the work that you do early on, the work that you're still doing, to try and identify source material that helps you to develop your own thinking. So some of this might be to do with just providing some kind of historical or contextual background for your topic. Some of this work might help you to find appropriate methodologies to help you examine the topic that you're exploring. It might be that they're about very specific architectural projects or landscape projects or practices that you're looking at. But very much the phase of work that you're going through in the early phases of dissertation is about identifying these kinds of networks and how they relate to your specific topic. As you move into the writing up phase, you want to try and communicate as much of this complex network as you can to your reader, to your examiner, so they can appreciate the legwork that you've done to understand the context, and they can appreciate how you're using entries in these kinds of networks to support your own work, or how your own observations are being used to challenge some existing work. So one of the aims that you should have when you're writing up, or you're thinking about writing up the dissertation as a final document, is how can you communicate as much of this rich network of exploration as you can. By doing so successfully, it clearly demonstrates that you're not plagiarizing ideas from other people. You're sharing the network of scholars, or of architects, or landscape designers, or urban designers, whoever it is that you're reading for support. You're sharing their work and bringing it into conversation with your own ideas. So, I'd say good academic practice is about communicating where your ideas have come from, how you've tested them, how you've mix them together in an interesting way, and how your own work sort of responds to that. So for me, the two sides of the same coin. If you're worrying about plagiarism or unfair means, they're very easy ways to avoid accusations of plagiarising or of using unfair means, and actually gaining credit for all of the legwork that you're doing in terms of testing out ideas. So the most obvious, perhaps the most commonly discussed, will be referencing. Again, lots of support about how to do referencing on Moodle, on the MMU skills website. But effectively, referencing means that when you're using ideas from other people, either directly using their words or summarising some of their ideas and putting them into your dissertation, you make a reference to the source that came from. So that could be you're reading a book, or you're reading an online article, you're watching a film or a documentary, you're talking to someone directly. Wherever you're reaching out and finding this source material, the principle that you should follow is that you provide a reference to that source, and to that book, that journal article, that website, that person that you interviewed, whatever it might be. Again, two forms of referencing, or two common forms that you might use in your writing. And first is direct quotes. So if you're using someone else's words, word for word, and you're borrowing a short sentence or a couple of sentences, you put these words in quotation marks, in direct quotes, and then you add a reference to say who the author is and what the title of that work is that you're quoting. So direct quotes are the direct, the words themselves, and as you find them from the source, and you copy them and insert them into your own writing. The double quotes indicates where your own words stop and someone else's words are included in your own writing. Again, really common and useful way of building up your own text. So a very, very practical approach to producing written work. In contrast to direct quotes, which sit in these quotation marks, you can also say, well, yeah, I'm borrowing from, my dissertation has been informed by some really useful work. I can't quote anything. I've read this book, and the approach, the overall argument in the book, or the approach they took to developing methodology has really informed what I have done. So rather than trying to find a page or a line that you can quote directly, it's common for you in this situation, if you're summarising a work, and then you can just say, as so and so writes in this book or in this article, and so on. So it helps to indicate how you're drawing in different kinds of support. Okay, Zain, if you're taking a long quote, can you break it up with ... in between? Yes, you can. I think the principle is that if you're taking a long quote and you need to chop bits out just to make it more focused, you shouldn't be fundamentally changing the meaning of the quote. And so you can't kind of turn it around to suit your own argument more. So yes, it's, to answer your question, it's fine for you to edit down a long quote just to make it more directly useful to your reader. Where you cut things out, you put in these 3 dots, which are called an ellipsis, to indicate that you as the writer have made an alteration to the original quote. But like, as I say, the principle is that when you're doing that, you're just editing for the benefit of the reader rather than actually changing the meaning of the quote. Okay, makes sense? So just to stay with referencing, because it is something that will affect all of you, all the way through the writing of the dissertation. Typically, with the referencing convention that we use at MMU, this is how a simple direct quote would look. So there are 3 types of benchmarking. This has come from a different source, so it sits in your text in quotation marks, and immediately afterwards you have the author, in this case Brown, the date of the text, in this case 1993, and then for a direct quote, you should also be able to provide a page number. Usually, if it's come from a book or a journal article, you would have a page number pretty easily accessible. If you're using a kind of Kindle edition, then it might be more difficult to, or some other online texts, sometimes it's quite hard to find a page number, in which case author and date would be adequate. Again, if you're referring to a website, then there are other ways of providing the relevant information. And the referencing and study support guide, which is linked at the bottom of this page to MMU Harvard. If you get the MMU Harvard guide, it will work you through all the kinds of source material that you might need to reference. So if you want to know how, or if you want to see a worked example of how to reference a book, or how to reference a journal article, how to reference an interview, how to reference a blog or a website, they're all available in the MMU Harvard guide. So I think once you get right in your text, you begin to use the MMU Harvard guide just to help you navigate through the forms of reference that are relevant for your text. The principles are that you give as much detail as possible. Certainly where you've got it, the author, the date and the page number. This works, or this system works, by also having a list of all the source material that you've used, that you provide at the end of your dissertation document. This is called a bibliography. And in the bibliography, you give the full details of the text or the sources that you're using. So in the text here, you can see that Brown, 1993, page 166. If you want to know the details of that publication from the text, you go to the back and you look at the bibliography, and under Brown, and you'd find Brown's full name, the name of the article or the book, and the location or the publication details for that book or whatever it is. So there are many different sources that you might use. Therefore, there are many different variations of how to give a reference. And if you have any doubt, then consult the MMU Harvard guide, and it will provide you with the right format to suit the information that you're trying to look up. So, as I keep saying, there's loads and loads of help and support, from simple handbooks and referencing guides, through to webinars, through to one-to-one tutorials that you can book with librarians. So if you've got any doubt about either the principles or the detail of how these systems work, then help is at hand. I realise that's really procedural and slightly threatening, which it's not meant to be, but it's a really serious, it's academic malpractice is taken really seriously. The flip side, academic good practice can gain you marks, can gain you credit with your examiners. So I think it's really important that you learn how to reference in order to demonstrate the breadth of the research, the breadth of the thinking that you've done. So if anyone's got any questions about either the principles of academic malpractice or about referencing, now's a good time to ask. If not, I'll have a very short break. I'll just get some other things lined up and then we'll go into part 2. No questions? Clear as mud? No idea what's happening. You've all disappeared. MMU Harvard doesn't use footnotes for citations. I mean, there are about, 10,000 different referencing conventions or citation styles. MMU Harvard, or the Harvard system in general, is usually what's called author date system. So as I demonstrated a few slides ago, it works by adding in the reference in brackets within your text, usually author's name, date, and if relevant, a page number. I hate it. Some people love it. I much prefer reading texts that use a numerical system, which is the footnote system. But unfortunately, Harvard isn't one of them. So university regs require you to use the MMU Harvard system. So referencing has to follow this convention, this author date system, where the reference itself sits in the text that you write. You can use numerical notes, which is, for those of you who, you must have seen it. So you're writing along your text, and you see something like 1, usually at the end of a sentence, and that either takes you to the bottom of the page where there's a little 1 and a note. So the Harvard system does allow for footnotes, but these are used to either clarify a particular point or to point to other work that might be relevant. It's not used for providing the reference to text or to sources that you've made use of. So in principle, unfortunately, the Harvard system doesn't allow citations to sit in footnotes. Footnotes are just for clarifications or digressions. Although you might see, depending on where you're reading, you might see other texts that do use a numerical footnote system. But that's the world we live in. It's the cruel world of MMU. As I say, some people love it. So just get used to the convention, and then it will very quickly become second nature when you're writing. Okay, can we just take 5 minutes? You go and have a bit of fresh air or have a little screen break. And I've just got to get some samples lined up for the next bit, which looks much more at the dissertation as a document. So 10:48 at the moment. If you can come back at 10:53, we'll pick up where we leave off. Okay, I'll see you shortly.
Recording stopped.
So welcome back. Okay, part two is more focused on the preparation of your actual document, and I'm going to go through 10 slides effectively, or 10 points that you might want to think about at various different locations in the document, but also thinking ahead to the document itself. I think will help you to kind of plan your work and you plan your work over the next few months, but also anticipate the kinds of connections between different activities that you're having to do as part of developing the dissertation overall. In Moodle, I've put a folder with a number of samples from previous years. I'll show a few of these when I've gone through the slides about the principles, and just really try and show the sort of range of dissertations that we get. So when I'm talking about principles, I think it's important that you think about how much or to what extent they actually apply to your individual dissertation, and then make decisions accordingly. Obviously, if they are bigger decisions, then test them out with your tutor. What I'm hoping to get across as well is that the dissertations that we get vary hugely in terms of their structure and their presentation, and that's fine. That's great. We're looking for a wide variety of different kinds of presentation that are appropriate to the wide variety of different kinds of topics that we get. Most of the samples that I'm going to show are from the MArch. Well, I've got a couple of landscape dissertations as well. You'll see when I show them, actually very similar. So whether you're on MArch, on the MLA, or architecture and urbanism, I think there's something that you can glean from these principles and from the samples that I show that make sense to all three of those degree programs. So yeah, just jump in. When you're thinking about writing up your dissertation, you'll probably be in a situation where you'll have become very familiar with the topic, its complexities, and some of the most important issues that relate to your field. So it's important that you take a step back, remind yourself that your dissertation will be read, it will be examined by someone who doesn't know you, doesn't necessarily know anything about your topic. So you just need to ease them in to your discussion, help them understand why it's interesting, why it's important. Think about why would anyone want to read your dissertation? What's interesting about it? So in the very first page, or at the beginning, at the start, you just want to ease people into the topic, give them a broad overview of what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, how it connects to broader debates before you start going into detail. During the text, it's important, or it's sometimes very necessary for you to break your topic up into a number of manageable chapters or interrelated investigations. Keep the reader informed. If you conclude one mini investigation and then you have to go off to introduce something else, tell them what these ideas are important, but I'm not going to continue exploring them in the next chapter. You have to wait 20 pages before I return to these issues, having opened up a number of other avenues of investigation. So tell the reader what it is that you're doing on the way through, help to guide them through your text, and give them the reassurance that you're in control of where it's going. You know, these are long documents, and so it's important that you provide that kind of reassurance to your reader on the way through. And again, as you're probably beginning to find, we're encouraging you with the dissertation to explore some pretty complex topics, examples, issues. You might have a complex set of questions or a complex research question, and there's no reason why you'd expect an easy answer from a complex study. So it's fine for you when you get to the end of your dissertation and to have a strong conclusion, but a conclusion that doesn't really provide a neat answer. So you have a strong conclusion that perhaps raises as many questions as it does provide answers. So we know these are complex debates that you're engaging with, and part of that is one of the consequences of that is it's difficult sometimes to identify a simple linear structure through your dissertation that allows a reader to start at the beginning and move through in a simple way. Guide them through and try and clarify how any particular chapter or phase of work relates to your overall question. Okay, things that you will know, certainly by the time you're writing up the final version of your dissertation, you'll know exactly what your most important resources have been, what was secondary. You know the resources that you looked at because you thought they were obvious, but actually they, on closer inspection, they haven't really helped you. So that kind of process of writing and the decisions, the evaluations that you've made on the way through in consultation with your tutor, that's part of the story, and it's important that you can explain that or share that with your reader, with your examiner. Also important to remember that you're not writing a report. It's not, again, not a linear set of questions. It can be much more narrative. And so you're trying to explore complex issues and gather together perhaps a wide range of evidence, perhaps even draw together contradictory evidence and evaluate those kinds of complexities in a way that allows you to put forward some kind of recommendations or conclusions. The way that you're identifying resources that might already exist, and the way that you identify and make your own resources by doing some kind of experiments in very broad terms. It could be including talking to architects or landscape architects or urban designers, their practices, could be talking to the public, could be doing questionnaires, and you might be making some of your own resources to help you answer your questions if that's appropriate. Expectation would be, for a piece of work of this length and complexity, it's impossible for you to rely on a single source to get you through. And so again, the way that you explain where your sources have come from and how you're evaluating them is a really important component of probably the early stages of writing your dissertation as a document. Thinking about the planning of the work that you do and the presentation of it in the final document go together. So it might be that you have different stages of work that you're timetabling between now and the end of April. They might translate very directly into a way of structuring a document. So think about how you can break down the overall text in your dissertation in a way that helps you write it and helps your reader or helps your examiner read it. And so the most obvious way of beginning this kind of thinking would be to divide your work into a number of chapters. Some of these could be introductory, some could be to do with explaining the context or historical background that's relevant. Some could be a walkthrough of the process of don't know, interviewing people that you've done. Some could be analysis and some could be conclusion. So it doesn't have to be rocket science, but you can think about how some kind of overall structure would help you and help your reader. It's also a useful device for you to do. A useful device for you to use is to include subheadings. And these might stay in the final document. It might be that you can use subheadings or bullet points to help you organise your thinking, help you organise the way that you're gathering information and that you're starting to write. And once a passage has been written up, and maybe you had a conversation with your tutor about it, it might be at that point you can take some of the subheadings out because the text itself flows. So again, there's no hard and fast rules, but you're trying to plan your work in terms of doing different activities. Can translate very directly into planning a document. Keeping to a structure, keeping to a timetable, and so on. Again, at this stage, tutors will say to you, just start writing early. It's fine for your dissertation to begin to grow out of lots of small fragments of writing. So, if you're reading something, if you're having a conversation, try and write it up. Even if you're just writing 100 words on the back of reading an article, that's useful because it gets you into the habit of writing. It might be that those 100 words find their way unedited into the final dissertation because they help capture a really important point from a text. It might be that they disperse or you write over them several times. But if you start writing early, it gets you into a good habit. It doesn't mean that your dissertation needs to flow yet, and you can have lots of fragments, lots of gaps, but it helps you see, it helps your tutor see how the dissertation is taking shape, helps you identify where you have work still to do, whether that's gathering, thinking, or analysing work, or whether it's simply writing up work. It helps you evaluate your own progress. As I say, I said a few minutes ago, you're asking complex questions, you're engaging quite often with very difficult debates, and the nature of that is that you can sometimes come across things that are very unexpected, and so be prepared for responding to the unexpected. Sometimes you'll find something that's, you speak to somebody who you didn't anticipate, but they might reveal something about your topic that causes you to reframe the whole dissertation. It might take you back to the initial question. You might want to refine the question in a way that allows you to really exploit this unexpected find. So do keep an open mind about coming across things that you don't expect, or you don't know about. And the dissertation structure, the process, and the document are robust enough to accommodate those kinds of surprises. Just the same way that you would do in the studio. Don't try and design it all in your head until it's finished and then write it up. Develop your arguments by writing and illustrating them. So get into the habit of writing about your topic. Share those pieces with your tutor, with other people in your dissertation tutorial group, and that will help you to refine the thinking that you're going through and the communication of that thinking. Again, that might cause you to go back and just refine the overall question or the overall framework for your work. In a bit more detail, these are the kinds of parts or chapters that you'd usually expect to find in a dissertation. For those of you who've done dissertations before, this will probably feel quite familiar. So at the beginning, at the very beginning, you usually have what's called a preface. Sometimes this is called an abstract. It's a really concise overview of the work that you're presenting. So 250 words maximum, half a page, a postcard. It's the it's probably the hardest thing for you to write because you've got so much to communicate. So it's a useful process for you to go through. And I try it periodically. You know, can you step back from the detail of what you're doing and write a short abstract? And if you can, then it's an indication that you're in control of the dissertation as a process, and that will make it easier for you to actually do the writing up, because you know what the stages might be in the writing, and you know what the goal is. So it enables you to reassure the reader, you know, explain to the reader, right, we're going to look at this before we look at that, and that's both of these moves are important to allow me to get to my final analysis. If you know where you're going, you can just keep the reader informed of whereabouts you are in that progression. So the preface is useful. It's useful not only for the reader, but it can be a useful thing for you to write. You know, you try one every month. It will just give you a snapshot of how clear you are about what your dissertation is doing overall. For everybody, we expect you to have a table of contents where you simply list out usually the chapter headings. Sometimes if you've got subheadings, it's fine for you to include chapters and subheadings. Again, this will be clearer when we look at the illustration, look at the examples. Also, if you have illustrations, it's usual to include a list of illustrations at the beginning, to say not only what they are, but where they've come from. And then if everyone, in some form, you need an introduction, and that's where you just remember that the people reading your dissertation know nothing about where it's going. So take it slow at the beginning, outline the issues, share your questions, set the scene, explain what it is that you were aiming to do, what your objectives have been. But also in the introduction, it's fine for you to explain what you haven't done or what you were unable to do. Again, that's not an admission of failure. It just demonstrates that you're in control of the version that you have written. And it's also usual in the introduction to give a very quick overview of the main sequence of chapters, you know, a little taster of what's to come. Once the introduction is out of the way and you're confident that you provided the reader with a clear overview of what's important and the dissertation structure itself, and then you start with the main body of the text. Usually, not always, usually this would begin with a literature review chapter, and possibly a separate methodology chapter. We find that actually with dissertations, a lot of the methodologies that you use are relatively straightforward and don't necessarily need a separate chapter. So a lot of students, where appropriate, will include an explanation of their straightforward methodology as part of the introduction. Just keeps it tucked into the scene setting, because it's not necessary to unpack it in any detail. Other dissertations where the methodology has been complicated or creative, you might want to have a separate methodology chapter that just allows you to explain how you've established a methodology, what that came from, why it responded to your research questions in a particular way, and how that feeds into the analysis that's coming up. So again, take advice from your tutor. Usually, for most of you, there'd be some kind of literature review chapter. Again, there are exceptions. Once you're through literature review and methodology, then you can settle into actually talking about, writing about the main topics. So if you're working with case studies, you might have a number of chapters each devoted to a case study. If your dissertation works better by exploring a number of topics or a number of themes, and you might have a number of chapters, each of which deals with a particular issue. Under that issue, You might mobilise different examples to clarify or expand or extend the analysis that you're presenting. Again, depending on the topic that you've chosen and the approach that you've chosen, some kind of structure will emerge that's logical for you. So the main material, the main text in dissertation will find its own way of being organised. Again, they're the kind of conversations that you'll have specifically with your tutor. And then, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the end, you have some kind of conclusions. I say, you don't expect it to be simple and straightforward. You're dealing quite often with very complex issues. The most important thing for you to bear in mind is that the analysis that you've carried out as part of your dissertation needs to be included in the main text itself. In conclusion, it's no more than a really concise summary of all of the work that you've done, highlighting the main points. And so again, it's a moment when you should be stepping back. Maybe you should be revisiting the initial question, the research question that started the whole thing off, and then going through the findings that you've laid out through the main text. Certainly it shouldn't be an invitation for you to introduce new material at this late point in the discussion. So the conclusion is a summary only. Again, it's an opportunity for you to reflect on the things that you've done, the methodologies that you've used, the things that you've had to redesign because of initial difficulties that you've encountered. All those kinds of reflective insights are a useful contribution to your conclusion. Again, they're not indications of failure. They're indications that you've been in control of the research that you've done, and when you've found something unexpected, whether that's a difficulty or a kind of bonus source, you've been able to just reframe the work that you've been doing slightly. And as I said a minute ago, your conclusion might end up posing as many questions as it provides answers. That's absolutely fine. These are complex debates that you're engaging in. Before the break, I was talking about this at length, so I won't go back through it, but a really important part of your dissertation document is the provision of referencing. Again, think of this as good academic practice and an opportunity for you to demonstrate the kind of breadth of research that you've done and the relevance of that research to your topic. So in part, good referencing is in your own self-interests. It's also something that other people down the line might be able to or might benefit from. And so, as I say, there's a folder of previous dissertations sitting on Moodle. If you find things in those examples that you think could relate to or help you in your own dissertations, you can use those previous students referencing conventions to help you locate some of the source material that you think might be useful for your topic. So referencing is for you, but it also allows future readers to retrace your steps, to find things that might be relevant for them. Just the same way that you might be using source material, maybe using the bibliography in a book as being more useful to you than the actual text in some cases. Yeah, so that's super important. As I mentioned before the break, the MMU or the Harvard system relies on in-text references and a separate list of all the sources that you use. And this is called the bibliography. And in simple terms, this would be an alphabetical list of the source material that you've used, just starting with authors, surname from A through to Z. If you want to, or if it makes sense for you to subdivide your bibliography, again, you could introduce subheadings. So for some students, this might be to distinguish primary resources, particularly if you've been using archives to help you write your dissertation. You might distinguish between primary resources that aren't publicly available from secondary sources. Some students find it useful or logical to separate books from articles, from websites, from films, site visits, and so on. So you subdivide the bibliography by type of resource, and so on. It's fine for you just to have one bibliography with no subdivision. Again, take advice from your tutor if you think it could benefit from having some kind of subdivision. Again, some dissertations have an appendix or have a number of appendices, and these are useful for you to stash supplementary material that you've gathered as part of the development of your dissertation. The key thing to think about if you're considering introducing an appendix is that there's no obligation on your examiner to look at the material there. If you have an appendix, it's by definition a supplement. It's a kind of nice to have, not part of your argument. And so the dissertation will be marked on its main text, and there might be reference made. Readers might look at the material that's in your appendix if they're curious, but it's not part of it can't be part of your main argument. So anything that's important must be in the main text. Usually, an appendix would include, for example, the transcript of an interview or interviews that you've done with participants. They can be selective. So if you had long interviews, this would run to many hundreds of pages. So it's fine for you to use the relevant sections of interviews and provide a transcript in the appendix. Some students use appendixes for material that they've found in archives. So it could be plans or drawings or master plans, things that you might make reference to, or you might take samples from in the main text, but you want to provide. They're really flexible. If you're doing a more ethnographic kind of study, you keep what are known as fieldwork diaries. Again, you can include all of your fieldwork diaries as an appendix if you think that's useful. It sort of demonstrates the amount of time and the kind of complexity of observations that you've been making. But again, most important thing, if you have an appendix or you have several appendices, these are supplementary. Everything of importance needs to be in the main text. If you have questions, ask your tutor. And we'll look at some examples of presentations in a couple of slides' time. When you're writing up, you're thinking about how best to present your argument, then there are questions that might be relevant in terms of sort of style, the grammar that you use, the kind of voice that you find to explain, or the voices that you use to communicate your dissertation, and how long they might be. There are issues, again, back to the first short section of today's lecture on ethics. If you're using the voices of other people, participants that you've worked with, how do you introduce those voices? How can you use those voices to sort of speak for themselves? If you're speaking on their behalf, how do you include those kinds of views in a way that is as, if you like, unbiased as possible? So if that applies to you, if you're using the voices from participants, again, you might want to take advice, specific advice from your tutor about how best to integrate those voices into your text. Usually have questions in these sessions about the physical arrangement of your dissertation. I mean, for all of the programs, we only ask you for a digital submission, but I know some students like to produce a hard copy, for their own records, for their own satisfaction, or to take to an interview. So it's, even though it's a digital submission, it's fine for you to think about how the dissertation might feel as a physical document, as a physical artifact, and how it's, how the experience of reading it has an effect on the clarity of the argument, the clarity of the analysis that you're putting forward. So again, I'll show you some samples in a second, but if you are curious about, or you might want to print it out in future, then you can anticipate that future hard copy as a way of helping you make decisions about how you lay it out. In terms of submission and of marking, it will be submitted online via Moodle, and it will be marked and on screen. And so you could perhaps design it in a way that is comfortable for screen reading. And part of this will be thinking about the relationship between image and text. For most of you, for all of us, we're working in very visual topics. Dissertations may or may not rely on visual material. Again, I'll show you some samples on the way through. But what we're not looking for is text that's been written simply as a text, and the night before you submit it, and we just sprinkle on some illustrations to, I don't know, to give it a bit of flavour. And if you're choosing illustrations, if you're including illustrations as part of your submission, then you should be clear what job they do. Their jobs might be various, from providing a bit of background through to supporting some of your core arguments. But you need to be clear for every illustration, what's it doing? And therefore, how big does it need to be? How much detail can it carry? How much direction, how many instructions do you need to give to your reader about how they should be viewing your illustrations? All of these are important and can help clarity, or can be frustrating if you don't do it properly. Okay, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna show you some, I'll show you some samples. If you have questions, then either shout out or put your question into the chat. Right, what am I doing? I know this is small. Just to check, you should be seeing on screen a couple of slides of the industrialised house. Is that coming through okay? I just want to check before. Yeah, okay, yeah. Fantastic. Right, as I said a few minutes ago, no matter which programme you're on, MLA, Urban Design or MArch, what we hope happens is that you choose a wide variety, you write a wide variety of interesting dissertations about a huge variety of different topics. Consequently, we are very happy to see very different kinds of dissertations. 我看黑屏好久了，然后我就 You're very happy to see a wide range of different formats adopted for dissertation. So I'm going to just show a few samples to illustrate some of the points that I've just been making, but also to try and reinforce the fact that we're happy with a wide range of different submissions. And there's not one best way of producing a dissertation. You really need to think about your own topic, your questions, and how you can develop a writing style and a presentation format that makes the most of the work that you've done. And so these are all from a few years ago. The first ones are from MArch, but the same principles apply. And so this is just a dissertation about industrialised house. And so it's pretty historical. You can see from the front cover, opening, or what we call front matter. So common to have acknowledgements in as part of this. Again, abstract, you see, as I mentioned, this is very short. It's a very concise summary of the key direction of the dissertation. Contents page, you see, this could be you. So a clear hierarchy within the dissertation of the main chapters you can see here, and then the sort of subheadings within those overall chapters, through to conclusion, bibliography, and so on. I appreciate that depending on what you're viewing this on, these images might be small, but all of these files are on Moodle, so you can, if there's anything interesting or anything that you want to go back and look at in a bit more detail, or you want to zoom in and explore in a bit more detail, you can pull these all off from Moodle and have a slower and better look. So table of contents, important for all of you. List of figures, it's likely that you'll all have some kind of lists of figures, but not necessarily the case. And I'll show you what I mean presently. Okay, so that's the sort of front matter. Onto the introduction. And then, like, the thing that I really wanted to pull out of this dissertation was the way it's working very explicitly between image and text. So all the way through, it's developing an analysis of the industrialisation of housing in the UK, particularly terrace housing, from the 18th century through more or less to the present. Has a comparative study between London and Liverpool, and all the way through, it's operating at a variety of different scales, from the kind of urban scale right through to the layout of domestic space. So the students got a lot going on, and they're using a very clear, clear conversation between images on the left-hand side and text on the right. So you can see the way that this has been made into a PDF. When we originally viewed it, it would have been images on the left and text on the right. Just the viewer here is pulling two double spreads up at the same time. But you can see the same sort of logic follows through all the way. Main text on the right-hand side, and images on the left, and with images with strong captions. Again, something for you to all think about in slightly different ways. If an image is working pretty hard to support the text, or it's even carrying your analysis at a certain moment, then you use the image captions to clarify what you think the image shows, or if there are instructions for use. And you want to point your reader at certain aspects of the images, use the captions to do that. So you can see here, the captions are quite long. These location plans on the next page are much more straightforward, so they just need a tiny caption. When the dissertation gets going, you begin to set out the context of the cities and the context of the developments over time. So in this case, there's a sort of fold out timeline which helps a student to draw connections between major changes to the architecture of the terraced house, and develops in materiality, develops in technology, develops in legislation, which form part of this story. So again, really useful contextualizing information. If you're writing a dissertation that does include some kind of historical development, then maybe a timeline will be your friend. That's your call. And it starts to zoom into the changes in the speculative building process, and it begins to zoom into parts of the city, in this case London, and begins to focus on certain streets that are in some way exemplary of the broader changes that are being studied. So you can see the student able to combine written text, thinking about city as a whole, thinking about legislative changes, and then kind of zooming us in to imagine what certain streets are like. And in this case, the zooming in continues. In this case, looking at or combining a photograph of a relevant example with a little detail through the front facade, showing the kind of construction of the parapets, the windows, certain dimensions that become a really important part of their analysis. So retracing out in detail connections between a little window reveal and a kind of national change in housing development. So you can see a dissertation that's carried, or the presentation of a dissertation that's carried and constantly supported by visual material, a variety of different scales, and visual material in a variety of different formats. And that's one thing. I just want to sort of contrast that with a sample that works without any illustrations. So very different topic, one written around sustainability, theories of sustainability compared to a more legislative approaches to try and encourage or enforce sustainable approaches to landscape and building. But in this case, apart from this one picture at the start, the sort of provocative image to set the scene, same opening, so abstract, an unusual image, but then past this point, table of contents, introduction, all the same ingredients as the previous. But then once the text gets going, it's entirely text-based. So it's a dissertation dealing very much with theories, different kinds of theories, and there was no need for this student to unnecessarily introduce any kind of visual material to support their argument. So if this applies to you, if you're working very theoretically, that's fine. It's what works for your topic, what's appropriate for your topic. So no need to slap in loads of gratuitous images if that really doesn't help you. So I just included that example to try and reassure you. These, I should say, perhaps all of the samples that I showed got really good marks. Not necessarily the best marks in the year, but they were marked very highly. So it's possible to get a really strong mark with no pictures. It's possible to get a really strong mark with loads of pictures. It really depends on the topic that you're writing about. Right, I'm trying to get behind my Zoom menu bar to show the next thing. Right, another one. This is a dissertation about atmospheres, so more about how people experience places. It's a comparative study between two different markets in Bury and Borough Market from memory. And again, what I think is useful to just share with you is the way it starts. Title, contents page. In this case, you'll see lots of appendices included because there's a lot of ethnographic observation work done as part of the dissertation, and that's collated and organised really clearly in this long list of appendices right at the end. So you'll see, total page count, super long, almost 130 pages, but the main text in about half of that. Again, list of figures, as you'll see in a minute. This is a dissertation that works to generate its argument by using visual material. So no surprise that there's a lot of figures being used. Again, it begins with an abstract, very concisely outlining what's about to come. And then we're into, the introduction. Just takes you as the reader into the topic. That explains a little bit more about why it's interesting, why it's relevant, how it's structured, and so on. Again, you pick up a pattern very quickly or you pick up a template of presentation. In this case, where, again, like the terrace house dissertation, there's text, on the right hand spread and a sort of full bleed image on the left to give quite a lot of atmosphere. It's a dissertation about different atmospheres in these markets. So the format of presentation tries to communicate that absorption to the reader. So first main chapter, literature review, helping to set out what the main ingredients of analysis have been. So here you can see useful use of subheadings just to help the student write these in the first place, but also as readers, these subheadings are useful because they provide us with a guide through different aspects of literature review. Again, in this case, looking at very early methodological work that's been done by social scientists, psychologists, in terms of distance and detail, which becomes an important part of the analysis that follows. So in this case, literature review explicitly pulling in like pilot studies, work that other people have done to try and study the same phenomena. And then beginning to set out the students' own methods. And what's interesting, or what's original about this dissertation, was the way that they set up their own kind of called radiograms or charts that they could use when they were doing field work in really busy places, these busy markets. So they've set these up based on literature review that they'd done previously, and they were trying to provide themselves with a kind of grid that would allow them to map atmosphere according to visual stimuli, sound, tactile, movement, thermal, chemical, and then convivial. And so they, in their early study, decided or established that these were the important ingredients that would allow them to kind of measure atmosphere. And then this as a template, something that they developed and allowed them to go to do the field work. So it's a sort of preparatory piece, but it's also something that allows them to generate interesting and substantiated analysis. So then you're taken into the markets themselves. The first one's Borough Market in London, in Southwark. So an introduction to the market itself, its location, and what it feels like if you don't know the market, some kind of background and overview, and then just begin to zoom us into the market layout itself and begin to classify different zones within the market. Again, you carried primarily with visual information, in this case, a sort of annotated location plan where these different phenomena are relevant, supplemented by photographs, in case we didn't know the market, and other important contextual information. In this case, just the size of some of the physical size from the passageways that make up this marketplace. So, a bit of context. Sorry, my computer's having a bit of a meltdown. It doesn't like moving forwards. But you can see we just eased into the study. You're talking about how the atmosphere of the markets changes at different days of the week, different times of the day, and then begins to break the analysis down into different sort of topics that have been introduced and studied. So you're looking at the overall market according to a variety of different kinds of criteria that have been established and justified by the student. And then you can see the reappearance of these kinds of radio diagrams or kind of radar diagrams. And so think surveys that the student has taken on site and then being tidied up here, used also for presentation. So again, for some of you, it might be appropriate that the form of data gathering and analysis and presentation all the same. For other topics, it might be that you need to do different things to gather data, different again for you analysing it, and different again for you presenting it. But in this case, one technique is used all the way through, which is convenient, and it provides the dissertation as a document with a kind of consistency that allows the reader to tune in to the topic. But also, as we move to Bury Market, same technique, same presentation structure allows easy comparison between these two different studies. Right, I'm conscious of time. So this is again another topic, very different form of dissertation. In this case, one that was generated by walking, by a process or methodology and a psychogeography that started a conversation between the student and the tutor, but also developed a methodology that was kind of app-based, so surveying a certain question, a certain set of questions and issues, particularly for women, walking safely or feeling safe when walking in the city. So it starts with an analysis of an existing problem, and then moves into a dissertation that begins to offer solutions or responses to the problem. So asking, what if we did this, made these changes, would this bring about improvements to the situation? That's one version. What if we did this? How would that improve? So, a different approach to opening up the topic, to developing complex and sophisticated interaction with the topic, and in this case, engaging quite a large number of participants to help the student develop their understanding and test possible suggestions on the way through. So it's laid out, it's been conducted using a lot of social media to gather in participants and encourage them to share their experiences, and also presenting analysis in the form of social media and suggesting other kinds of smart technologies and their implementation, or they're evaluating their possible implementation longer term. So kind of urban architecture technology approach, but you'll see it starts in exactly the same way as the others. A preface, acknowledgements, abstract, contents, figures, all these now familiar to you, introductions. In this case, the text, the presentation of the text uses the author date form of referencing, but you'll see down the side or in the gutter of most of the pages, the students using what we call footnotes, side notes, really to expand on or to contextualize some of the issues that she's engaging with. So not part of the main analysis, but they help provide important context or speculation, or they link to other sections of the dissertation, almost like a hyperlink. So again, the actual layout of the text, main text, secondary text, and illustrations, very much generated by and responsive to the topic that's being studied here. You can see, even the use of different coloured backgrounds. It's helping the student to distinguish between illustrations and text, between text and quotes or these sort of call-outs. So, typographically more adventurous, but in a way that is absolutely appropriate to and generated by the topic that she's discussing. Again, interspersed with these very powerful illustrations that again work to provide the text with a rhythm of key points on the way through. So again, I won't go through it in any detail, but clearly designed to be read on screen, or if it was a hard copy, to be read as a double spread, so that these kinds of extra space can be can be attained in the presentation. In this case, using diagrams to explain the way that the argument has been set up. So it's a version of the literature review, kind of overview of the literature and the methodology and justification of that. So again, if you've got a complex interaction between or interrelationship between the parts of your dissertation, you might think of doing something like this to help your reader navigate through it and understand the interconnections that are important between the various parts of your work. Okay, so I'll just, again, if this is interesting and relevant, it's on Moodle, so you can go back to it and read through it in more detail. Again, very different dissertation with a different feel to it. One that's been generated by the topic itself. And then perhaps with the last example, unless there are any questions. So this is an example from the MLA, the Landscape Architecture course. But as you see, the format is very similar to the MArch examples that I've just been showing. So the principles apply to most dissertations. You know, a cover sheet, table of contents, again, a very clear statement of the hierarchy within the text. So list of figures, introduction, main chapter headings in larger, different coloured text, and then subheadings below. So as a reader opening this up for the first time, it's quite easy for us to understand the overall structure of the text, what's important, the key moves, in its organisation, and then the smaller scale development of the text, development of the argument within that main text. Again, list of figures, introduction, all very familiar. And again, really good use of illustrations where appropriate. So in this case, understanding different structures of landscape, illustrations sitting directly adjacent to the text that is discussing the issue. Similarly here, views of landscape that are being discussed directly in the adjacent text. So this relationship between the images that you include and the text that accompanies them is really important. In this case, the illustrations are large enough to be legible, but they're not so complicated that they need more space. So you have to think about each one on its own terms. You see, as we get going with the text, really clear presentation typographically. What we can see is when the students using long quotes from other sources, they're being referenced, but also they're being inset. So the left-hand margin is just kicked in slightly. Again, common typographic practice, if you're using long quotes, just helps you distinguish between what's your own writing and what's being borrowed from others. Usually it's done for effect, but usually it's done when the quote is quite long, more than 50 or 60 words. Shorter quotes can just sit into the text itself. So something that you can consider. Again, illustrations being used for a wide variety of different jobs, just referring in this case to important texts that they're using as part of their own dissertation. Others, giving a bit of background or a bit of context. Other illustrations referring more directly to specific examples of landscape practice that are being analysed. Again, combining photographs with these sorts of charts, with more analytical orthographic drawings and so on. So you can see it's really clear, easy to follow. Right at the end, in this case, bibliography organised as one block alphabetically. So far, so good. Oops. Well, I've hopefully swapped my screen back on the PowerPoint. Okay. So I hope you can see a slide that says 10 common points of confusion. You see that? Oh, fantastic. Right, nearly there. So just to wrap up, things to think about and things to avoid. As I said at the start of, or just after the break, when you get to putting your dissertation text together, for the final submission, you'll be so familiar with the topic. Some things about it will seem really obvious to you. Some really important moves that you've made, decisions that you've made, that they'll be in your subconscious, and they'll inform everything that you've done, but you won't even be thinking about them anymore. So, as a reminder, as you're putting your dissertation to bed, just make sure that you're actually stating those questions that you started with, that you're sharing the things that seem almost so obvious to you, they're embarrassing. I shouldn't need to say this for you, the reader, to understand what I'm doing. If in doubt, state it, state your questions for sure. But there are questions that we can't answer. For all of you in different ways, we'll have to strike a balance between the amount of description that you include and the amount of analysis that you carry out. How that actually falls in terms of a percentage, I can't say. It will depend on your topic. So for some subjects, some dissertations, actually gathering information and organising it in a way that allows you to describe a complex phenomena is one of the main challenges. So if that is appropriate for your dissertation, you'd expect to have quite a lot of text that is providing detailed description. It can be text and images, various different varieties. And so it might be that your main challenge, your main contribution from the dissertation is a really clear, descriptive text that allows other people to access the complexity of a project that hasn't been described before. And that's fine, and you'll be rewarded for that. Other dissertations, it might be that actually describing the thing that you're interested in is really straightforward, or it's been done 1,000 times by other people. And what you're really trying to do is to embark on some interesting analysis of a fairly familiar everyday environment. So I think of the markets that I've just shown you. It's a very familiar everyday situation. What was interesting in that student's dissertation was the way they were able to develop a very sophisticated framework to support analysis and gathering of fieldwork and presentation of that analysis. So think about it, have a conversation with your tutor if you need to, and for your own topic, try and establish the right balance between quantity of description and quantity of analysis. We expect a bit of both, but there's not a right balance, and that's rewarded in different ways, which I'll talk about in a second. Again, things that you should look out for in the days and weeks before submission. Just make sure that your introduction and your conclusion actually belong together. In your introduction, you make claims about where your question came from, about the context of your study, about how you're going to carry it out, how it's structured. And then in the conclusion, you would be expected to return to your question and then very quickly summarise all the main points in your dissertation. So introduction and conclusion need to talk to each other. They're probably the last things that you write. So the main text will grow first. You'll pull your analyses through. That will allow you to write your conclusion. And perhaps the last thing that you write is your introduction, because it's only at that point you know what it is that you're introducing. So make sure introduction and conclusion are paired together. And then I guess the killer punch is make sure that they're actually introducing the dissertation that you're presenting. Yeah, so very common in essays, perhaps less so in dissertations. For essay to start, in my essay I'll do A, B, and C. To have a random main text and then a conclusion that claims I have shown A, B, and C. So the introduction and the conclusion are correlating, but the main text hasn't met any of the claims. So we want the whole thing to stack up. The main lines of inquiry need to glue together. So that's the sort of thing that you can check as your text moves towards a final version. It's also the sort of things that other people can point out to you. So if possible, ask other people to read your work. It could be a tutor, it could be mates you got in the studio, it could be family or friends or just random passers-by. Try it out. If other people can't understand the main points that you're writing, that's an indication that you need to perhaps go back and revisit something, clarify it. And so agreements between intro, the main text, and the conclusion are key. I'm conscious that a lot of what I've been talking about this morning seems quite prescriptive. What we're trying to provide you with is some kind of guide to the things that should be in the dissertation, but they're only guides. So we get plenty of dissertations that adopt slightly different or radically different structures for good reason and that are really successful. So it is possible for you not to have a separate chapter for a literature review, for example, if you distribute the literature through the main text. As I mentioned, it's possible not to have a methodology chapter that you might see on kind of lists of requirements of dissertation contents, if your methodology can be dealt with simply in your introduction. Think about the topic that you're exploring and then develop, with these kind of guides in mind, develop an approach to writing it up, to structuring it and writing it up that you feel comfortable with. And it is, after all, a creative piece of work, not a report. Again, these are sort of obvious, but I'll share them with you anyway. Top tips, maybe that you come back to in March and April. As much as possible, try and review your own, try and become reflective of your own writing. Try and develop the way that you write in ways that respond to the subject, which is why I keep saying, start writing from today if you haven't started already. You just get into the habit of writing about your dissertation topic. You develop a voice that's appropriate for explaining this particular topic. It might be written work in combination with visual work. You develop a way of communicating that works, that you can refine. Try it out with people, even if it's just short sections. If they get what you want them to get from it, then you're on the right lines. As I said in the literature review lecture, try and learn to read like a writer. So as you're gathering stuff to help you, be critical of it, but also, in terms of its content and how it might help your dissertation develop, but also if you come across samples of writing that you admire or you think are really clear for the topic, then perhaps hold on to those as good examples, and ask yourself or have a conversation with other people about what it is about that text that provides its clarity. Is there something in that you can learn from and redeploy for your own work? So think about how other papers have been structured, how they develop a kind of language that's appropriate to the topic, how they're using quotes and images, if they're using other material as part of that presentation. You could be doing that too. Again, it's as a document that you submit, as a document that is examined, it is unfortunately linear. That's the nature of text, but the process isn't linear. So keep saying start writing as soon as possible. Start writing in the middle of your dissertation. You'll be producing small fragments of text, some of which might fall into literature review chapters or introductions. Some of it might fall into accounts of fieldwork that you do or analysis. Start writing, and those little fragments of writing can move around until they find the right home in the overall structure. If you start early, it will write itself effectively. Again, try and be confident about what you're writing. Again, back to good academic practice, you'll have tested out your own ideas by comparing them, learning from or challenging existing work from other people. So include those other opinions, other ideas in your text. That helps you to substantiate some of the claims that you're making, some of the analysis that you're putting forward, and it gives your writing authority. You're not apologetic about what you're claiming, and you're able to gather up evidence that supports the conclusions that you're reaching. Just because it's a dissertation, it's not an invitation to bullshit your way through it. Try and write as clearly as possible. As I've said several times this morning, the topics, the debates that you engage with are going to be difficult, complex. They might not have an easy answer, but try and navigate through those complexities as clearly as you can. You don't try and write using long words if short ones will do. Again, part of your dissertation as a final document for submission is to do with the argument that you've developed and how you've supported it, but also it's an examination of how well you're able to plan your work, to design your research, and to carry it out. So keeping the reader, keeping your examiner aware of what you're doing and how your text is developing is a way of reassuring them that it has been your process has been carefully undertaken. If you've come across difficulties or surprises, you've been able to think about the best way of responding to those, rather than pretending that it's all been plain sailing. Again, you'll become the expert on your topic. It might not feel like it just yet, but in the next few weeks, as you really develop into your dissertations, you more than anyone will know what it is that you're talking about. And with that expertise comes a certain responsibility. You're the one that can guide the reader through your dissertation document. And that takes some work because it is long and complex. And lastly, edit. You try and edit for clarity. It's back to no bullshitting. Edit to make the text as clear as possible. And by that I mean don't just proofread it, and certainly don't just rely on spell check. You need to sense check what you're writing. And if there are clearer ways of explaining it, then perhaps you can refine those sections of text. Right, last slide, I think. This is for the MArch students only. I appreciate the Architecture and Urbanism and the MLA programs have different submission deadlines, but for the MArch students amongst you, the dissertation deadline is the 6th of March. For some reason that's beyond our control, Moodle defaults to a 9 p.m. Deadline, which I think is really uncivilized. So that's the deadline. I'd suggest that you get it in well before. You might have other things to do on a Friday evening, especially after you've finished your dissertation. But that's the absolute deadline. Clearly, you can submit before then. All submissions go via Turnitin, which is a piece of plagiarism detection software. I'm sure you've come across. If you don't know what Turnitin is, then some of the study skills sessions that I've put links to on Moodle will give you an introduction to how Turnitin works. Maximum file size is 100 meg, which should be way big enough for anything that you want to include in your dissertation. Occasionally we have students who make films or audio clips as part of their work. So if you genuinely do have a massive file, there are ways in which we can navigate the submission process, either by embedding them carefully or getting an exemption to the file limit, or just hosting those videos or audio files in a separate site and putting links in within your document. Moodle area is the one that we know and love. It's where all the dissertation stuff is held at the moment, so you should be familiar with going to visit that. For almost all of you, it's the dissertation area with an F at the end if you're studying full time. For the 4 students that are on the part-time route, it's the same initial code, but with a P at the end of it. You can't go wrong. If you click on either of these links in the submission area of Moodle, you'll find, as I'm sure you're familiar with already, you'll find an entry with your name. You'll find your name already there, so you can't accidentally submit into the wrong Moodle area. The submission can come in a variety of different formats, but we'd strongly recommend that you however you produce your text, you convert it to a PDF before submission. If students that have submitted via Word or other, sometimes via InDesign, the text comes through, but the formatting tends to go crazy. So there's no point spending time carefully formatting something and then submitting it using the layout program. I'd strongly recommend you take a PDF just to stabilize the submission and make sure that we see it in the format that you designed it in. Please submit one file, straightforward. Also, can you please name your file in this format? I mean, you wouldn't believe how many students submit, or in years gone by have submitted a file called My Dissertation. There's nearly 200 of you. That's not very helpful. So if you can put certainly your family name and your MMU ID, maybe with some extra detail like your given name and that it's the dissertation. I'll remind you nearer the time, but that just helps us in case files get lost in the MMU system. And as I said, just for clarity, for all 3 programs, submission's digital. There's no hard copy requirement. Sometimes there are some legacy versions of handbooks that get passed on between students or creep up from the ghosts of Moodle past. If you read anywhere that there's a hard copy submission, you've got an old document, I'm afraid. There's no hard copy requirement. You might want to design your layout for your own hard copy, for your own personal use later. But in terms of submission, that's not a requirement. Lastly, again, this is for MArch students. In terms of its assessment, your dissertation's assessment, there are 5 criteria that we use, which touch on each of the 5 topics that have formed the subjects of these dissertation lectures. So in no particular order of importance or weighting, you'll be assessed in terms of your overall research design, how you put the whole thing together, how you design a question, and situate that. You'll be assessed against literature review, or the way that you're able to contextualize your own dissertation into a broader frame of work. You'll be assessed against how you carry out your dissertation. So it's methodological approach and how appropriate that is for the question. Not how complicated it is, how appropriate it is for the question. Be assessed according to the execution of your plan. How clearly you carry out your work, how clearly you structure and write up, how you analyse your argument, I beg your pardon, and then finally how you write, how clearly you write and present your work. We don't assign percentages to these 5 assessment criteria because we encourage a wide variety of different dissertation topics. And so, I think depending on the subject that you've chosen, the question that you've written, these 5 different assessment criteria will have a different weighting. So for some of you, contextualization might be all that you do, gathering information and organising it in a very descriptive way, but that's absolutely appropriate. For others, it might be that the methodological approach is really novel and time-consuming, and that's the main kind of contribution of the dissertation. So think back to the example that I just showed of the psychogeography, women walking dissertation, very much about an innovative and methodological approach to a question. Others, it might be quality of theoretical analysis that's more appropriate for the topic that you've chosen. So between these 5 criteria, you'll all be doing all 5, but the relative weight will shift quite significantly between different dissertation topics. So we kind of keep that flex in the system so that dissertation can be rewarded on its strengths, wherever they might be against these 5 criteria. Okay, that will be the end of that. So if anyone's got any questions, either shout out or stick it in the chat. You haven't been assigned a tutor for the afternoon class. How do you mean? Haven't been assigned a dissertation tutor? Or a dissertation shooter, as the live captions have got it. Okay. I don't know how that happened. Are you MArch students? What I suggest is that if you, okay, so MA Architecture and Urbanism and Master in Landscape Architecture, you're here for the lectures, but your dissertation arrangements will be made by your programme leaders. So depending on when you started and which degree programme you're on, your dissertation tutor will be coming to you in good time. So don't panic. You'll hear from your programme leader. Okay. Yeah, dissertation. Yeah, so sometimes, if you know of other people that have an interest in or an expertise in your topic, yeah, it's fine for you to get in touch with someone else, whether they're a member of staff in the school that you think might have an insight into your topic, or in a different department in the university, or even in a different university. It's fine for you to gather resources from, or to try and gather resources from wherever you can identify them. And that can be from libraries, from the web, from visiting buildings, from talking to people, from observing how they use buildings, and that includes other academics, so academics and practitioners. So if you want to interview other people, that could include other tutors in the school, for sure. Any more?
I'd get it fixed.
Someone limbering up for a question, or are we good? I can hear someone talking. I'm not sure if that's just sort of background noise or if it's a question. If it's background noise, could you mute? If it's a question, could you speak up? Because I'm having difficulty hearing. No, I'll take that silence.
I mentioned that to pull off what you need to bring it over, and then we'll get them to come back and do it all.
Overhearing everyone's chit chat in the background. I guess that means that we're all done. So thank you very much for listening. I know that these lectures are quite dry and abstract. Right at the start, the most important is that you can pick out the bits that you need to help and apply them to your own dissertation topic to help you develop an approach that is interesting and appropriate.
Fantastic. That would be a smarter way to do it than just sticking 2 little bits of the metal at both ends.
Yeah.
What's that? On the trim.
I'm good. So I'll wait.
Just put like 2 little bits of metal at both ends.
See some of you this afternoon. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
We don't hold of anything that much bigger than the standard.